Welcome back. This is the second part of the video for week number 4B. In 4A, I went over some of the process aspects of the course this week. Especially important was the description that I gave of how to set up your own central desktop account so that you can transfer your work breakdown structure and start to build a project using that software. So be sure and listen to that. In this video, I'm going to cover the content, hit the highlights at least, for the phase on implementation, project implementation. So I'll be going through some of those areas that I'd like to remind you about as you're reading and studying this week and getting ready for the examination. So this circle shows where we are in terms of the cycle, or I'm sorry, the phase model is what we call it now, PMD Pro1 phase model. And remember that this is an iterative cycle between planning and implementation, and this is where we spend, implementation is where we spend most of our time, and in a lot of the training and processes for design monitoring evaluation, and within the NGO international development community, this is the one that receives the least attention. So I hope that you're seeing the importance of what we're doing. Again, a reminder that you be sure and notice the 5 principles and the 6 disciplines, and today we'll be touching on the ones that are ticked in the green. Let me start by the principle that PM is iterative or iterative. And throughout the project, it's important to treat the implementation plan as a living document, not one that's static or unchangeable. The idea is that over time, the implementation plan needs to change, and we often show those changes in what? The charter document that we talked about in the setup module phase. And so that helps you to get greater detail on the areas of the triple constraint, the schedule, cost, and resources, in order to meet the project scope. So iterative is round and round. And it's the act of repeating a task a second, third, and more times to achieve a desired result. So you do detailed planning, implementation, replanning, reimplementation, and you keep going around and around in that cycle. It's also in the PMD Pro called rolling wave planning. That's the iterative process of providing increasing levels of detail to the project implementation plan over time. I think the PMD Pro guide might also mention progressive elaboration. That basically means as you are progressing forward in implementation, you need to be elaborating or providing more detail. And so just like the waves and the surfer come over and over again, we need to do planning in an iterative way. All right, let me go into something that may not have been clear just from reading the guide. Something that I like to emphasize when I teach this course is the difference between these 3 concepts. Assumption, you've already talked about those in the log frame. Risk, we've talked about those as well. And then today we'll be introducing issue. What are the similarities and what are the differences between those 3? I think they're very clear, and hopefully you will by the end of this course. Assumptions really are statements that are identified in order to complete cause-effect logic, and in our context they're used mostly in logical frameworks. All right, so they are positive statements that are needed to complete logic. A risk, on the other hand, is a negative. It's a possibility that needs to be managed, something that could happen, and the tool that we talked about there was called the risk register. So almost every assumption that's in the log frame will be turned into a negative and managed as a risk. An issue then is when a risk actually happens. It's a happening. It's something that takes place, a problem. It's identified in order to solve real problems, and we're going to talk about today the issues log. Now, not every risk will become an issue because some of them will have been managed and some risks just don't happen. And you will have issues that were not on the risk register or were not in the assumptions because things happen that we don't know about. All right, this is just a reminder. You've already seen this. It's called the risk register. Since risks will change over time, the risk register must be updated during implementation. That's extremely important to manage the ever-changing risk. And so hopefully this table looks familiar from a previous module. Now I want to just highlight what may be, next to the work breakdown structure, the most important and critical tool to add to the work that you're doing. It's called the issues or issues log, either way. The issue log is a way of capturing and recording the problems and the issues as they arise for management. So an issues log should have issues entered in and issues leaving the issues log once they've been resolved or managed. Okay, so it's a grid, and it can look like this, or you can customize it to your own needs. But for sure, you're going to have a description of the issue, and it's usually live. This is a live document, and the issue is described at the moment that it's actually happening. Who is going to actually own the issue, and that should be a person or a description that will be able to be identified as an individual, so either the person themselves or the specific job that person does. That's extremely important because somebody has to be responsible for that issue. Now, another column that I've seen in these would be who raised the issue, because that could be someone who's different from the person who's managing it. And it may be important to be accountable to those people, especially if they're stakeholders, partners, or community members, because they need to know that the project team is being responsive and taking them seriously. So that's extremely important. What date was the issue opened specifically? And then you're going to have the date that it closed. So when did it enter the log? When did it leave the log? And if you've got issues that don't leave the log, you've got problems, and that's what need to be managed with highest priority. And then a running status, what's happening to the issue in terms of its resolution, and then what was the resolution that allowed it to exit the log. So using the Delta River case study, in particular the latrine building project, the issue is that it rained for 2 days, resulting in significant work delay. That happened started raining on the 11th of July. The 11th of July, the rain started in the morning. The workers went home. The 12th July noon, rain stopped, but the workers were not there. They didn't report that day. 12th July in the afternoon, the project team inspected the site and determined the work could resume on the 13th. And then the 13th, the workers arrived and agreed to work extra hours. So the resolution then was that the workers would work 3 extra hours for 2 days to make up for the rain delay, and that would put them back on track, back on their critical path. All right, so the issues log then can be extremely valuable for resolving issues, being accountable to people who raise those issues. It's also great as a monitoring and evaluation tool. It's a great management tool, something to be used as the basis for meetings with project teams, with subordinates, superiors. There are a lot of ways that you can find value on the issues log. And I encourage you to attempt doing one of these for practice and putting this into your list of things that you will apply after the course. Another tool, an important area in the implementation, is communications. And even though we won't spend a lot of time in the PMD Pro talking about this, it's a fact that a lot of the problems and issues and failures in projects come from the softer side of management. They come from human interactions, from poor communication. So one of the other integrated tools that can be developed would be a communication plan, and that could be put onto a grid like this with what is the communication that is being planned, what's the purpose of that communication, who's the intended audience, who will be the author, and maybe there'll be somebody else who will write the communication, somebody who it'll be assigned to. What will be the communication vehicle? Is it a newsletter? Is it a blog? Is it something posted on a bulletin board? And then how often will it be communicated? And these are all the reasons, some of the reasons that were listed in the guide. Another plan is the human resources plan. A lot of problems and issues that arise in projects have to do with people. Acquiring the project team, developing the project team, and managing the project team. It's extremely important to map out the processes and to plan, and this is an example of one of those areas of indirect work that's extremely important, that's often underemphasized. A tool that can be used for human resources capacity assessment is called a spider diagram, and this is described in the PMD Pro guide. This is an example of a spider diagram that's being used to assess capacity and to mark what the aspirational goals are for some of the tools in project management. So it looks like a spider diagram, that's why it's called that, and you'll see there's a scale. The middle of the spider diagram is a 0, and the outer edges are 10s. You can have any kind of scale that you want. Actually, this is just one example. You can have anything that you want around the outside of the spider diagram. This one then has put on two types of data. One is the triangles, which would be the baseline, and this could be done by an individual as part of a performance plan. And then a performance review. It could be done by a project team, or it could be done by an organization like a partner, or even the project team itself. So the triangles then would be at the beginning where they say, okay, where are we now relative to our competencies and skills on these tools? And then the stars are where would we like to be in a certain period of time, say 6 months or whatever you think about. And then the area between those two would be the gaps, and those would be the personal or team organizational development priorities. So that's an example of a tool that many people in the PMD Pro1 course find useful on the human resource side. I'm just going to mention a little bit about supply chain management. You should read this part carefully, that this is extremely important, that being able to track the suppliers, making sure they're reliable, trying to minimize corruption, deal with corruption when it happens, the indirect work of transporting materials, security, safety, all of these things need to be part of your detailed work and planning. Then there are 3 areas, procurement, logistics, and asset management. Be sure that you're clear on what those 3 areas are for the exam. The PMD Pro also talks about a certain type of budgeting that is extremely important, that builds upon the kind of detail that you find in the work breakdown structure and allows for a better analysis and monitoring of what's happening in project management, and that's called activity-based budgets. Most or a lot of organizations do line item budgeting that are not as useful because it doesn't provide the detail for the expenditures, the planned expenditures, and the actuals in the categories that match up with the way that the work has been broken down. So we'll talk about earned value analysis in the next module as well. That comes from the kind of detail that you find here. Another principle that is part of the PMD Pro is that project management is integrated. Remember, the project constraints are connected, making it impossible to change one without impacting the other. The dynamic continues in the context of the implementation plan. Each element of the project implementation plan is connected to the others. So remember, it's not a linear process. We're not just going from start to finish, that there are a lot of things that are dependent upon each other. And finally today, a principle that is participation, and this could be mentioned anywhere. I've just put it into this module because there's space for it, and it's extremely important in implementation. But planning to involve appropriate stakeholders is important. A tool that you will be interested in and may already be using is called a RACI or a RACI, or I've even heard it called a RACI. That is to identify the roles and accountability, and this can be done for any number of processes. What we're suggesting here is that you'll take the detailed work from your work breakdown structure, or at least the work packages, and you'll put them on the vertical column of this grid, and then you'll identify who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. That's where the letters come from. The responsible person is the person in charge of actually performing the task or doing the work. The accountable is the person who makes sure that the task is done. And it could be that these are the same people, especially in small projects. Larger projects, they're likely to be different people. The consulted group are people who you are going to have a two-way communication process, and you expect people who are consulted to provide input, and you're going to pay attention to that input in the decisions that you make. And then finally, you've got a column that is informed, people who you're giving information to, you're communicating with, but you're not necessarily expecting them to provide you with feedback. So it's very useful to identify those people in advance and then to keep this updated. And like I said, the RACI can be used for a number of different tools and different processes in PMD Pro, so it has a lot of applications. Those are the highlights for the module on project management implementation. If you have any questions, be sure that you communicate with me. I'll be glad to help you out. That's the end of the video, week 4, part B.